Carter G. Woodson reflected on the history of African Americans and how that history wasn't being taught in the United States. He said, quote, "If a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated." In 1926, Carter G. Woodson, along with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or the ASALH, of which he was a founder, launched Negro History Week. They selected the month of February because Frederick Douglass's birthday is on February 14th, and Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator's birthday, is on February 12th. In 1976, Black History Month was officially recognized by President Gerald Ford, who called upon us to, quote, "seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history," close quote. But what is Black history? And does it still need to be taught? On this episode of The Uncomfortable Truth, we're going to explore just that. This is Loki Mulholland, and it's time to get uncomfortable. Well, hello, Levon.
Hello, Loki. How are you?
Doing good. Yeah, so I want to explore this idea of Black History Month with you. What is Black history?
Well, one of the things that I've started doing is I've stopped using Black history, not because it's bad,
right,
but because I now talk about history as history from a Black perspective, which is different than Black history,
right?
Because I want white America. I use that term because that's what it is, just white and black. But
sure,
there used to be, historically, there was no such thing as white and black. I use that because I want white America to own it and to understand that I'm talking about history, American history, not just from Black history. So let's just talk about history from a Black perspective.
Right.
I understand the reason for Black History Month. There are a lot of things that used to be Black things because they were not allowed to be white things.
Well, BET, Ebony Magazine.
Exactly. All of the Jet Magazine, all of those things, or The Defender, which was a Black newspaper, all of those things came to be because Black people were treated like they didn't exist. They were pack animals, is what they were. So I understand why Black history was born.
Right.
I think one of the things I've been struggling with, and now I don't get out and speak the way I used to, and I hope that starts happening again. But I used to talk to a lot of young people, high schools, kids, and junior high school.
Yeah.
And they are not taught about Black people in America. They are not taught,
right?
And that's white or Black, but mostly I spoke to white people. And I realized that a lot of what we do, whether it's Black history or celebrations, we do it to people that already appreciate it, already understand it, that already come from that.
Right.
And I think that Black History Month should exist. It's just to change a little bit.
Okay.
Most of the textbooks, they come from Texas or California because those are the largest districts, and they're trying to rewrite history. But you're not going to get in a school everything that you should know about Black people.
Right.
But I think that we should push for the schools to include Black people in the history of this country, whether it's slavery or the invention of medicine or the invention of whatever, the peanuts, whatever, that it becomes
well, God created the peanuts,
Well, yes, but just to do something with it. But I think that people, we do Martin Luther King every year.
I'm not saying God's white. I'm just saying God created
I understand
peanut,
that.
right? So,
but I'm saying I'm saying who created something out of the peanuts. I mean, God might have put them here, but it took somebody else to do something with them. But we don't.
And it was a Black man, so there we go.
There you go. The first open heart surgery. all kinds of stuff that black people did, or the cotton gin. I know they say like Whitney did it, but what white person have you ever heard of that had anything to do with cotton?
Right.
All right. So, but what I'm saying is that a lot of the children, the young people that I talk to, don't understand Black history. They don't attend the events. We just have black people go do that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what about Black history being a part of not just people that understand or that want to know more about Black history, but people that don't normally see Black history, that don't see it as separate, but see it as their history. That that's the only thing I find wrong with it.
So traditionally, Black history, think about school. Oh, right, we got Black History Month. Well, one, it's only going to be taught this 1 month. So now suddenly you've said it's separate, right? Because you're highlighting it as a separate event from the rest of history, as if it's a parallel track with white history in America, instead of running on the same tracks.
Well, it always was. It always was separate.
Well, sure. I mean, once you start to isolate it and bring it up, there's almost this collective groan of like, oh my gosh, Black History Month again. And it always seems to focus on the struggle.
Right.
Whether it be slavery or the civil rights movement, and how you position that as well. So, well, black people were slaves. Okay, well, they were enslaved, but instead of this position of less than, teaching it from the position of, well, what about the liberators? What about those who were struggling against, who were enslaved and struggling for freedom?
Right.
And repositioning this idea of how Black history should be viewed, because it creates this dynamic of how African Americans even perceive themselves at that point, of outside of America, if you will.
Exactly. Well, the problem with that is that there's now becoming more of it. I think we're beyond where Carter G. Woodson was.
Okay.
People are more educated. So there was a need to talk about the black people as struggling, to be a part of, to know where they came from, to know who they are. And I think that people do, the majority of Americans feel it has nothing to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, the black folks over there celebrating and what have you. It's got nothing to do with us, so they're going to blame us for something.
Right.
The white Americans just waiting to be blamed. Well,
sure.
It's not their fault. It's not the modern day young person's fault. That they loaded up the cotton in New York and they shipped it over to England and they shipped the clothes back. That's not them. But how about when you teach a course in the economics of America, you understand how the role that black people played in that as black people, because they did.
Right.
So you talk about the economics of American growth by including slavery or shipping stuff to England or them shipping stuff back or whatever. So you include them in the history that you're making. Now,
right. Yeah.
And the other stuff, I mean, you can't do everything in a textbook, but there ought to be an argument for having things like that in a textbook so that people understand that all of us created this country.
Mm-hmm.
That if you talk about the Second World War, you talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, but you talk about it as you talk about the soldiers that participated as soldiers.
An Ordinary Hero was my first award-winning documentary. It's about the life of my mother, Joan Trumpower Mulholland, and her participation in the civil rights movement. For most of us, our mothers are heroes because they're mothers, and mom is just mom. But when your mother's a civil rights icon, and yet you never really knew it, things change. Go check out An Ordinary Hero and find out how choosing to do what was right instead of what was easy helped change the world. You can find it on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection. Was Black History Week, well, Negro History Week they called it, and Black History Month.
Right.
Who was that really for?
Black people.
Was that for okay.
I believe that. But I think that was necessary because we were written out of history. You think about it. You go back and look at the books that Black people did not write,
mm-hmm.
and you will see that the Black man was written out of history, or
right.
If he was written in at all. Like I'm telling you, I went all the way through school. Now I finished high school in 1961.
All right.
Nowhere in that book that they talk about us as slaves or the white people, the Klan, or any of that. The politics of Mississippi. That was not talked about.
Slavery wasn't even brought up?
It might have been, but it wasn't obviously didn't make a dent. So
not into the school books.
Not in the school books. Because they don't.
So you're saying in Mississippi when you were in school they never taught anything about slavery?
I don't remember it. I mean, Let me be fair. I don't remember that. And keep in mind, at the time we tried to stay away from slavery. Like we weren't slaves. Of course we were. We don't own.
When you say we, who's we?
We the Black man does not own. We would try. Black people stayed away from slavery. Black people didn't talk about slavery. So that is a part of the history of this country. Why did they have slaves? What were they about? Right? So it was an economic decision. So let's talk about it. Right. All right. Let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about when people came across in ships.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to do more of that, but we need to do it so that the white people understand that it's the history of the country.
Right.
It's not for Black people anymore. It shouldn't be. We are Black people are 13% of the population of the United States.
Right.
We're not going to win anything. And, of course, now there's class involved as well. But so I'm not opposed to Black History Month. But when you sold the celluloids,
celluloids? Oh my gosh, dude.
Maybe. Yeah, I know. I knew as soon as I said it. I reached way back for that. But that's what happens. The pictures of Martin Luther King and John Lewis, it's that's all that people get out of it.
Right.
Black and white.
Yeah.
They don't understand that there's a history here. And that history needs to be taught and protected. But the history didn't stop at 1961 or 62. We had history.
Right.
And we became more and more a part of this country.
Mm-hmm.
Not for the purpose of the Black man, but it helps the country.
Right.
Right. So we have, occasionally we get a movie. They all come out in February. No, Black history is a part of America. So when Texas rewrites the books, which they will do, because they buy a lot of books.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't do everything, but we should push for the history of Black people in America, and Indians and Chinese as well.
Sure.
But let's tell the truth. Let's not whitewash everything. But we, as Black people, have insisted on that whitewashing.
So the next question then becomes, well, one of the things is about Black history is that when we teach Black history, particularly in relationship to American history, Black history does not start in America.
No, it does not.
Now, when we teach American history, we're more than happy to dip back into Europe and talk about Rome and Greece and all these other places.
Well, we own Egypt. We do admit to Egypt, even though that's part of Africa.
Yes, we do talk about that, but that's some weird sort of pseudo sort of place that doesn't quite fit into Africa in the mindset of white people when you teach history. It's more about pyramids and the Nile and whatever,
That is correct.
right?
Yes.
But I mean, obviously, there's a much greater history uh, of the African people beyond just boarding, being forced to board some ships and and being enslaved and so forth. But we don't teach that. We don't talk about that because that's not a part of American history. But yet somehow Europe is a part of American history. Ain't that something?
Well, we do that by inference because England was a part of American history. So obviously
Sure.
everywhere else was.
Right.
But that's how they do it.
Right.
And that's okay. I mean, you can make England a part of the history of this country. You can make that war that we had with the British a part of the American history.
Right.
But what about everybody else that was a part of it?
Sure.
For instance, we don't talk about the Trail of Tears.
Right.
Right? The Indians talk about it, but we don't.
Sure.
Well, that's a part of history because it never would have been that if it wasn't for gold and land and oil
Right.
and stuff like that. So there's a way to do it. There's a way to have it, but people just get left out, and that's what Black History Month is supposed to be.
Right.
What I'm saying is, I'm not so much what people say, is who's listening.
Sure.
That's the key.
But then you have this. Well, and who's teaching it? I mean, the majority of teachers in America are white. 80% are white women, and they're only going to teach what they've been taught.
Correct.
And what that person's been taught, and what that person's been taught. Most people aren't going out of their way to really gather the additional information. So the school says, "Hey, guess what? We're going to talk about Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and and let's move on because we got more important things to talk about." And so there's probably not that big of an effort being put into it to begin with. I mean, I don't want to knock teachers. I'm just saying that's just kind of the realities. They've got standards they've got to teach to and be held accountable for and so forth. But the lack of the integration of the Black experience within American history throughout, if you did that, starting with the Revolutionary War. I mean, who's the first person killed in the Revolutionary War?
Well, it's Crispus Attucks, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, 1/8 of the Continental Army was Black.
Yes.
I mean, under the command of George Washington, for goodness sake. So, I mean, all of that is there. The inventors, the explorers. I mean, everyone is a part of this history.
Right.
And yet, so if you did that, if you integrated that into it, would we lose Black History Month then? Does it become necessary at that point?
Eventually, no, it doesn't.
Would there be a fear of losing Black History Month?
I think there would be. I think it would be for a while. Yeah. Because of again, because of history.
Sure.
Traditionally, it has been, written out. So I think that fear would always be there. So
you can write it in, but guess what? It's going to be written back out at some point. I mean, it's an interesting thought to think about. I just as we try to integrate the different experiences, so they're not just parallel tracks.
Right.
That we have one track that's going, and this is what everyone's on board the same train, right? And it's called the American experience. It's called American history. And yeah, it's not a pretty history. Most countries' histories aren't that pretty. I mean, I don't know why everyone thinks, well, you got the American exceptionalism, of course, but my gosh, I mean,
yeah, they're not.
I'm trying to think of one country where, someone wasn't a dirtbag and someone didn't do something horrible. And I mean, nothing's that rosy. Everyone's got baggage, right? I guess is my point. And so why would we expect American history to be any different, except for the fact that who's writing this history, and what is their fear of writing a truer version of our history?
Well, you have a lot of that, but I think the problem is we're so separate. We the white America does not want to include a lot of Black Americans, and a lot of Black Americans are afraid to include white America. So you get the separation of history, of language, of talking, of everything.
Right.
And it's up to, unfortunately, it is very often up to the oppressed, and I use that word
Sure.
guardedly, but the oppressed to educate people about what's wrong.
Right.
Because the larger part of, I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, but the larger part of America does not care.
Right.
Right. And those that do care very often get pushed aside.
Right.
Especially now. Right. So that didn't used to be the case. You know, there was those that wanted to be involved in the plight of the black people in this country were involved.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was they were not appreciated.
Right.
Right. So it was until the time that we got what we call power. God knows that we don't have any, but what we call power, we started excluding. As soon as we got it, we started excluding those white Americans who did not, who knew our history,
Mm-hmm.
who understood our history, who wanted it to be different. Because
Mm-hmm.
we don't trust anybody who's that color. So now you have more separation than you used to have.
My work has taken me to a lot of places, and I've been fortunate to meet some incredible people. But when I came to Selma and met Joanne Blackman Bland, I knew I was in the presence of greatness. Joanne was 11 years old when she was attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in 1965. She wasn't old enough to vote, but understood its importance enough to be there. After Selma is an in-depth look at how our right to vote has eroded since the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The fight for the right to vote continues. Get informed. You can find After Selma on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection. In the 70s and 80s, there was this movement to really just focus on the Black experience within the civil rights movement and
Right.
writing out those white participants to the point where people are actually really shocked that there were white people involved in the civil rights movement, even though you see them in the photos.
Yeah. God, there were tons of them.
Right. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, that's my understanding is that there was a movement to put the focus of the civil rights movement as exclusively as Black people struggling for their rights.
Correct. But
Okay.
that was at the time you needed to do that because there were very few Black people in this country who had the power or the inclination to stand up and fight.
Right.
But white people did. White people did.
Right. But by writing white people out of that story, do you now create the us versus them even further? Whereas you could have shown how whites and Blacks worked together and could have created something a little more cohesive, which is what we're doing now. And we're seeing that more now. This, in the museums and so forth, you're starting to see these threads that are woven into this experience of the freedom movements,
right?
Of different people participating.
Correct.
That wasn't exclusively the domain of African Americans.
I think that happened because, for instance, if you look at the civil rights movement before, the issues were the right to vote,
right,
which white people had,
sure,
the right to ride what they wanted, to live what they wanted, to see, I guess, who they wanted to. All the white people had that.
Mm-hmm.
Their mantra was, let's have everybody have that. Most of them meant that. So it was easy to pinpoint those kinds of things. What's missing is the fact that they are still going on.
Right.
And the white people are saying, well, it's not my problem.
Right.
That's your problem. For two reasons. One is because they don't see it. They don't see that happening. I mean, we had Barack Obama there after all.
Right. We're done.
So they don't see that happening. That's one. And the other one is they don't see it as their problem. Even when they see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
You have to fix it.
Right.
So I think that was the mistake that was made. But it was not, for most of us, it was not on purpose. It was, oh, so black people need to do stuff for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because up until that time, it was white people were doing things for us.
Right.
So we just didn't understand that you needed, and I know people get upset about this word, but we did not understand the need for allies in the struggle.
Right.
And now that we need them, we either have people that are indifferent or don't want anything to do with it. They understand it, they just don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
So, yes, that was a mistake, I think. But again, that's me.
Well, sure. I mean, just you and I are just pontificating. These are just our own personal opinions and insights into these topics. We don't represent everybody, but we're just lending our voices to a discussion.
I've had people tell me. I mean, when I ask like at Black History Month, or I ask about anything where people are taught. I ask white kids, I ask black kids.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? What is it that you learn? And most of them have not learned anything, white or black.
Right.
They know that they don't like white people. I said, well, why don't you like white people? Well, because they do this. Well, when I turn around and I said, well, you may be right, but I've had more done to me by black people than white people.
Right.
Now, not to the degree that it used to be.
Sure.
I'm not as afraid, but they don't know what to do with that. And that becomes all right because they don't know what to do with it. Because they can't turn around and say, some of the white people are my friends. And some of the white people are fight for me.
So taking a look at Black History Month, there's this defensive posture that takes place amongst whites that every time Black History Month is brought up, and you said this, people get a little too sensitive about it, feeling that this is just an airing of grievances and a reminder of how horrible white people were to black people.
Right.
Whereas Carter G. Woodson's, attempt was to elevate the stature of African Americans, to illuminate people on the accomplishments of African Americans.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So how do you then teach Black history to the audience that needs?
Black people don't know their history in this country.
Right. And that's an interesting point, because the assumption is that black people would know their history.
No.
Right? Because they're black and that's their history.
No.
And I've said to somebody once, I said, well, how much do you know about white history? I mean, if you're Irish, right? Like my family is historically, I can't tell you one thing about Ireland.
Right.
But no one expects me to know that.
Exactly.
But again, coming back to this idea that it's this, how do you teach this history without making, well, you know what?
You stop making it somebody responsible for it. In other words, I should be able to tell what went on during the civil rights movement,
right,
without stepping on your toes about what went on.
Right.
We don't know how to do that yet, but that is what it's all about.
Right, exactly.
You didn't do it. The history of racism in this country is different than the racists in this country.
Right.
So let's talk about, as soon as you can get people to admit to, the foundations of a country,
mm-hmm.
we should be able to tell the story without penalizing or jumping down the throat of or blaming the person of today, but having them have some responsibility for making things different.
Well, let me ask you this then. Yeah, and I like that. So let me put it this way then. We can teach the history of racism in the past, and let people know this is not about what you didn't do.
Right.
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 However, it's recognizing that this pattern existed and we still live in a racist society. Doesn't mean everyone's racist.
Right.
It just means our society still has this foundation of racism.
Right.
And so now the question becomes is, if that is true, which it is, then what is your part in that?
Right.
Are you going to stand idly by, or are you going to be one of those freedom fighters? Are you going to be one of those abolitionists? Right? What is your place in this historical narrative? So yeah, we're going to talk about the past because you need to learn about the past to
Right.
understand the present.
Right.
But now you live in the present. What are you doing in the present to make sure that racism doesn't exist? Because clearly, every white person I ever talked to, I never met a single white person who said that they are racist. I just haven't. Right?
Well,
Uh,
then because they don't think they are.
right, exactly. And they are opposed to racism. They think racism is horrible, which they should.
But we tell them, we meaning black people, tell them that racism is anything that you say or do that we don't like.
Okay.
That's wrong. That's wrong. You know that's it's racism is a system, and it
Right.
existed for years. You know that doesn't make you a racist. That makes that statement racist. One of the examples that I like, I don't know what it is on our side of the fence, but when I had to study women's rights
Uh-huh.
in at work, like they had a course, and something as simple as allowing a joke to be told in your presence
Right.
that is anti-female, and you don't say anything, you're part of the problem,
Right. I agree with
right?
that.
So something
Because your
as simple,
silence is validation or your laughter.
absolutely, absolutely. So how about you just do something as simple as saying, "Not in my presence,"
Right.
or "You can't." To saying that means this.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that. You don't have to go to the ramparts. You don't have to. No, I'm not asking you to do that.
To the ramparts. Man, it was like celluloid again?
Well, they still have ramparts.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. In my other life, I'm a filmmaker, and one of my more fascinating films I created is the award-winning film titled Black, White, and Us. It's about viewing racism through the lens of transracial adoptions in Utah. Utah? Yeah, Utah. It just so happens to be the transracial adoption capital of the world. So what happens when white families who didn't believe racism existed anymore adopts a black child? Find it on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection. I was in a situation where just recently, wherein we were talking about voiceovers in some particular videos, and someone said, "Well, why are they all men?" And I had to explain a little bit why. They said, "Well, can we bring some, let's bring in some different genders and some different ethnicities?" And I said, "Oh, well, what does an ethnicity sound like?"
Right.
Right? I'm like, what is that? Now I'm baiting them, of course. And then someone says, "Oh, well, I can tell the difference." I said,
Oh,
"Really? So what does that sound like to you? Is there, what does a black person sound like, or a Hispanic person sound like?
right.
Can you explain that to me?" And of course, everyone else in the room's like, "No, no, 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 just." And they're telling him, "Just stop. Don't even try to have this discussion."
Right.
And but I was speaking out. I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't, I was being a little condescending, because I know the person and they know me, and they text me afterwards and said, "Hey, I apologize if I offended you."
Okay.
Now, I'm going to talk to him and say, "Do you understand why it was offensive?"
Right.
Because they know me and they know what I'm about. They know that, this is a teaching opportunity. I'm not going to sit here and blow them out of the water. I just will say, "Hey, let me help you understand a little bit why this is offensive."
Right.
But again, coming back to this idea of Black history, do we need it?
We do. The answer is yes.
And if the answer is yes, how do we teach it?
I don't know. I don't know yet.
I was at a conference. So it was the Association of African American Museums. I think that's what it was. The conference. It was DC a couple years ago, and a lady, African American lady about my age, came up to me and said, and thanked me for the work that we're doing. I said, when I was growing up,
Right.
I was the only black kid in my class. And every time slavery was brought up, everyone turned and looked at me. And all I knew about my people was that we were slaves. And that's all I thought of myself.
Right.
Now, clearly, she was taught something else. I would assume she would have taught something else at home. But obviously, the reinforcement of your peers and your teachers and so forth in your textbooks really has a profound effect on a kid. It doesn't matter what your parents say,
No, it
right?
doesn't.
It does, but the repetition that takes
right.
place, and it made me think that if that impacted her that much, imagine what her white peers were thinking of her.
Right.
If she was thinking that of herself, how were they seeing her?
I think where we start, quite honestly, I mean, with all its faults, like the Black History Month is whatever. By the way, before I go on, they don't talk as much as home as you think they do about slavery and about what goes on and about Black history. They don't know it either. Black people do not know. But Black History Month will come and go, and us older people will attend all the events and will none of them, and Facebook will have stuff, and all that stuff will go on.
Mm-hmm.
But in the home, you do not have a lot of stuff talked about, even during the 60s and the 70s when stuff was happening.
Yeah.
People don't know. People don't know. So I think we have to change, who hears us in terms of Black history. So I think it needs to continue.
Mm-hmm.
But how about we ask somebody how to teach it? How do Jewish people teach about the Holocaust?
Right.
Right. Now I don't know all of that they do, but I speak for Facing History,
mm-hmm.
and they have started to. They have a civil rights division where they teach stuff.
Right.
So thousands of people learn from it. They teach the teachers. The teachers go back and teach this. But again, it's we limit it to what happened as opposed to what's happening.
Right.
So
and part of that impacts how white people perceive racism because
yes,
I mean because we've hammered it so much as the past, that's how they see it in these black and white photographs.
Right.
And we're all downstream of the past,
Of course.
So the impact
well, that's what we do.
Doesn't trickle through. We don't even think about the impact of World War II beyond just the war is over. We don't think about the geopolitical ramifications of that, the economic ramifications.
Absolutely not. Most people, if I talk to you about the code talkers, right?
Right.
And so they used to have somebody to travel with the code talkers.
Mm-hmm.
Now I met them and I got a book and the whole bit. But the guy that was traveling with them, when you watch the movie, is to protect the code talkers.
Right.
But what most people don't know, it's also to shoot him. And no way is that person to be captured.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it's not a written language.
Right.
So imagine the Navajo, they're proud of the fact that they have a code talker, but to learn that the person that is the code talker is supposed to be killed.
Right.
If there's any possibility of him being captured.
Right.
That is American history.
Yeah.
The guy was in the war.
Right.
So let's just tell history as it is. Let's let people tell it. Let my daughter, I tell history. I tell her what went on in the movement.
Sure.
But I tell her what's going on now.
Right.
So I don't know what the way is. I really don't. But I know that when I speak, I talk about everything.
Sure.
I talk about what goes on now, what's going on then, because it's important. Because what's happening now to Black people
mm-hmm.
is because of what used to happen.
Want a great way to help a worthy organization and educate children about the civil rights movement? Visit our foundation, the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation, at thejtmfoundation.org. That's thejtmfoundation.org. THEfoundation.org. We are a 501c3 established to help end racism through education. A $5 monthly recurring donation will provide curriculum for 30 students. As my mother used to say, I can't do everything, but I can do something, because doing nothing is not an option. If you have wanted to help in this cause, but didn't know how, now you can. The Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation at thejtmfoundation.org. 20, 30 years from now, we're going to look back and either say things changed, or we're shaking our heads going, how come things didn't change?
Exactly.
Yeah, I've often said that history doesn't change, just our understanding of it.
And the players.
And the players and the new information that comes to light. It's always been there. It's just a matter of how we talk about it and who has the say and how it's being said.
And not be ashamed of it. I
Right.
mean, you would be amazed, or maybe not, maybe you wouldn't, but a lot of people would be amazed at the number of Black people who are ashamed of having been slaves.
Right.
Now, I understand that. I get it. But there's nothing to be ashamed of.
Right.
You know, the people that are standing in front of you they survived, number one. They built things.
Mm-hmm.
They were industrious people. So what's to be ashamed of?
Yeah.
You as an individual. So talk about it.
Yeah.
Let the white person know about it. Not just the Black person. It's I don't know.
So we create Black History Month. We have, American Indian Month. We have, Hispanic Heritage Month. We got all these different months. We got Women's History Month in March. Where's White People Month?
Well, again. You don't need that,
right? But you get, but that's the rhetoric you hear a lot of times. Well, gee, what about White People Month? Well, that's 12 months out of the year.
I was about to say that.
Yeah,
all the time.
Right.
But if you don't like all those months, that's okay. We'll have one month. It's called History Month.
Right.
We'll have 2 months, or 2 months, whatever it is,
right.
And we'll talk about how those people were treated then and how they are treated now.
Well, think about that then. If we take away all the different, months that we've designated and just call it history, but recognize the fact that we're going to, weave in all these threads into this history, right? Now we're talking about something different, because otherwise it's still just white history.
Right. Exactly.
Because and that's just what people. I remember I was at a university in Indiana, and can't remember the name at the moment, but I was speaking to this. We're doing a screening that night, but I was speaking to a couple of the classes, and just kind of impromptu, I said, let's throw some names up on the board here. I mean, tell me some people in American, tell me some famous American, people in American history, famous people. And, there was George Washington. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. George Washington, number one. Right. Second one was Beyonce. I'm like, okay, well, Beyonce. And we're going down the list, and we'll fill up the board. And then then we added it up, and over 80% were white men.
Right.
Right. Now, of course, women make up half the population,
right?
But 80% was white men. So the representation wasn't there, clearly. And it's how, and these were college-educated kids growing up, wherever, but in America. And this was very reflective of what they had learned through, the repetition of elementary school and middle school and high school, and those names that they were able to spit out off the top of their head is clearly what was hammered home the most.
But they didn't do, in those days, they didn't do women. They didn't do Black people. They didn't do, we don't count.
Right. Well, look, this was 2 years ago. So these kids were, they're only, 20 years old. So we're only talking about going back 20 years, the early aughts of them going to school. And yet, even though we're so progressive, the 21st century, these kids clearly were still only learning this white history narrative, even though we've put so much emphasis on all these other parts. What really came out, that was really startling to me.
No, well, yeah, I could see that it would be, but again, that's what they're taught.
Right.
That's what we all taught.
Yeah.
We're all taught that. White and Black, we're taught that.
Yeah. Hey, Lavama, I think we're wrapped on this subject, but it's worth talking about, and Well, I mean, hey, happy Black History Month, by the way. I mean, this is your month, right? So,
well, it's my month.
Yeah, man.
I'm gonna do something to celebrate. I'm not sure what yet.
yeah. But I appreciate it as always. And until next time, bud.
All right, I'll talk to you.
Thank you again for listening. Make sure you head to my Patreon page at patreon.com/Loki Mulholland. Show a little love if you can, and get access to even more content. Until next time, don't be afraid to get uncomfortable.